Mom said that we still had to do school.
Yeah.
It's gonna be difficult because there's a lot of school subjects that we need help with.
Yeah.
And everybody else can't help. And Mom is the only one allowed to check off our schoolwork.
Ah, so you just have to pile it up for her when she gets back. She'll have to check it. I'm behind in checking off stuff. I have a bunch of it down in this guy that I have to go through and check off because I get really busy doing all of this. And this takes a lot of time. So I figure my boys' stuff can wait. As long as they're doing okay. If they're not doing okay, then I have an issue, but if they're doing okay, then their stuff can wait. Yeah, these guys have no legs. I'll tell you what they are. There's a name for them for sure. Let's see.
Let's see. Dragon.
Yeah, they just have no legs. They're legless dragons.
Oh, yeah, definitely not
Dragon. They're called, I'm looking it up.
They look like
Worms.
worms and legs. Fuzzy
WYRMS. Worms? I don't know. Types of dragons. Oh, Varan. That's what I thought they were. Type of dragon originated in Europe. This is a Varan. But they have arms on the front. Mine don't have any arms, right?
No.
No arms. Okay. So they have no arms.
Worms and wings.
And they're worms. Gigantic serpents. No, they have wings. They have wings. It's not like these. Okay, dragon. With Morning, Wilson. Wings and no legs. There we go.
It certainly has a little bit of a
Dragon with 2 wings has 4 legs. A Baron has 2 wings and 2 legs. A Drake has no wings and 4 legs. A worm has no wings and no legs. Okay, so mine are nothing.
Yours are just
Smile. Yeah. Wings and legs. These are not technically dragons because they have no legs. So it's like if they're not like a worm. They're WYRM. So these are not worms. These are, I thought they were barons, but they have, it says they lack back legs. No, they have back legs and wings, but no 4 legs. I don't have any legs.
that makes sense.
They have like tucked up under their wings or their shields or something, but I don't see that. I don't know, it's just we were walking through this place in Atlanta, a big chandelier. Because we wanted something different in this spot, and I knew they had interesting stuff, so.
Those are the seahorses up there.
Yeah, those are cool. There's like smaller versions of these, but we're walking along in there, and then there this thing was, and I was like, hey, Lil, look at that. And I looked at it and I was like, okay, I have to have that. This is super weird. And the guy said it was from it's yes, and it's from like the 1940s, you think, at the latest.
You can do another identify that species. Just put that
Yeah, we
there.
do that. Use the app. How are you, Lily? It's so good to see your face. Good. You all right? Yeah. How is Grandma?
Not doing good.
Sorry. Were you glad that you at least got your visit in?
Yeah.
There you go. That's good. I'm glad that you did too. That's important. It's a tough thing. I have been there and done that several times.
I was just missing Armstrong's, Anthony, and
Sky. Yeah. Let me see if I have any messages from anybody that I missed. No, I don't think so, unless there's an email. I don't see any. Okay, let's see. Do any of these want Sky? Nope. Nope. All right. Well, we can go ahead and start. I'll give them like 1 minute, make sure nobody else is coming, that I haven't missed anybody here. I didn't really go through my email very well this morning. I glanced at it, and that's as good as I got. So you went to the desert and then you came home and it snowed.
Yeah.
That's fun. She did. She went to Arizona. That's where she was for a while. Arizona.
I like snow better than the desert.
They keep changing their mind about this weekend. First they said there would be snow, then they said no, then they said yes.
Friday,
Yeah,
like on Thursday, weather forecasted it definitely
Somebody-
snowed, yeah.
there's
And
Sky.
Friday it just rained all day.
Yeah, they don't know what they're doing. So I got Sky here. So, all right, we'll go ahead and we'll start. So today we're going to talk about plant structure and function, and we're going to actually be wrapping up plants next week. Today's lab is going to take 2 weeks. You're going to have to set it up today, and we're going to have some seeds that are going to hopefully sprout by next week. Hopefully, I'm going to do some stuff to kind of speed up the sprouting. Like I'm going to make the place where they're growing as warm as I can make it, so that's more likely that they'll sprout. So we're using radish seeds because I was looking for what sprouts fast, and everything recommended radish seeds for this lab. So we're talking about plant structure and function. So just like animals, plants have organs and they have systems. So we'll be talking about that today. So just to look at your homework, here comes somebody. Who we got?
Anthony.
And Darcy. Everybody's here. Let me hand these bags. Here, Darcy, this one's yours. Here you go. Lewis. Anthony. There you go. We got everybody that's here. Awesome. Okay. So, ready. So I was just saying right before y'all got in here that we're starting our lesson on plant structure and function today. All right. So this is homework 20. Let's see what we have for homework 20. What are 5 adaptations that plants need to survive on land? Anybody remember any of them? What'd you get?
Reproduction and a way to pass water.
Okay, that's 2. Yeah, what adaptations do plants need to survive on land?
Roots.
Roots. What do roots do? They help, like Darcy said, they help bring water through the plant.
Air.
They need to be able to get some carbon dioxide could be one. What else do we have?
Sunlight.
They need to be able to make food, right? So here's what we have. For plants to be able to survive on land, they need to be able to obtain water and nutrients from their surroundings. So that's what roots are for. That's good. They need to be able to retain water, which is part of like, how we talked about how leaves have that waxy cuticle on them and stems do too. That's what that's for, to keep the water from evaporating from the plant. And then transport materials, that's what Darcy was saying, move water around their bodies. Support, be able to support their bodies. If you're in water, you're just floating, right? You need to be able to support your bodies. So if you've had a flower and you don't give it water in the vase, you'll notice that it starts to get really droopy, like it wilts. And that's because it's lacking in support. And what plants use for support is obviously they use their cellular structure and their cellulose, right? But they also use a lot of water for support. And it's called turgor pressure. And those cells will actually swell up and get fat. And when they're nice and strong like that, they can hold the plant up. But if you take the water away, they will wilt and they will just fall over. And that's true for herbaceous plants. We talk about woody plants like trees and stuff. Their support system is a little different. They still have that going on, but then they also produce cellulose in levels so much that even if the plant dries out, it's still gonna stand up. It'll be dead, but it'll stand there. You've seen a dead tree standing? We've got one about halfway down the hill that I think we're gonna have to push over soon.
We can do that. Or you just got a mini
Last Tuesday, we went to we go to a hike group and we went to Chattahoochee Point.
Oh, I love it over there.
And we knocked down like 3 rotten trees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last thing was reproduce, which we also said over here, right? You have to be able to reproduce. If you can't reproduce, you got yourself, you're one organism, and that's it, you're done, right? So reproduction is very important for all living things. Actually, the goal of pretty much every living thing is to pass its DNA on to the next generation. That's like the whole reason for anything to be alive. All right, so we're going to start with seedless non-vascular plants. Now, last week, we kind of brushed over this. This week, we're going to go more in depth. So what we're going to do is we're starting to talk about plants that are the most basic, the oldest plants when we talk about like in evolutionary terms, the simplest, least complex. And then we're going to move to the most complex. So the least complex, simplest types of plants are what we call seedless and non-vascular. So Darcy was talking about a system to move nutrients and water around, right? That's a vascular system. Some plants don't even have that, and some plants don't even have seeds. Can you think of a plant that doesn't have a seed? What do you think, Drew? Moss, good example. Anybody else have one? Darcy?
I was gonna say lemon, but I'm like.
No, they got seeds in them. Yeah, for sure. Flowers, so sunflowers have seeds. Now, flowers are actually, flower is the reproductive part of a plant, and the seeds are actually formed, as we're going to see, in one of the reproductive parts called the ovary, and the ovary is what turns into fruit. So when you eat an apple, you are eating an apple tree ovary. That's what you're eating. Yeah. Grass has seed, actually. If you don't cut it and it gets tall enough, you'll see it makes these little frondy things with seeds.
Ragweed.
Ragweed has seeds. That's what the little floaty things are. So the first thing we're going to talk about is green algae. All right, now, do you have a question?
No, I was gonna say, what's it called? Not moss, but like
If it comes back to you, tell me. It's okay. So, okay, green algae. Now, this is one of these things. All right. Now, when we talked about protists, remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about protists and we had lab, we had our amoeba and our paramecium and our euglena. All right. Now, green algae is one of these things that depending on which biologist you're talking to, they might categorize it as a protist or they might categorize it as a plant. Some green algae. And it's kind of walks that line. And that's important because when things do that, when they kind of walk the line between one category of organisms and another, that's a link. That's an evolutionary link, usually, from protists to plants. So these guys really stride the line. So when we're talking about green algae, we're talking specifically in this case about two different types, which is chlorophyta and streptophyta, which is what we call charophytes. And they look like this. See this little guy down here? This little guy, he has chloroplasts, okay? And so does these charophytes, these Spirogyra, they have chloroplasts too. So did a euglena, if you remember. Our euglena was green and he had chloroplasts. Remember we had the cotton fibers, we had to trap them in and they were swimming really fast. Do you remember that? So we still categorize euglenas as protists, but when it gets to stuff like this guy right here, Spirogyra, it's like, he really strides the line. And so we think that what happened is some of these guys kind of evolved this way and these guys kind of evolved this way. So we're really thinking it's the charophytes that eventually turned into our land plants and that it's the chlorophytes that kind of turned into more like our water plants. You ever seen kelp?
Yeah.
Okay, so kelp is technically an algae, not a plant. But you see how it kind of looks like a plant? Yeah, it kind of strides the line. So what's green algae? Green algae are large informal groups of algae consisting of chlorophyta and charophyta or streptophyta, which are now placed in separate divisions. There are about 22,000 species of green algae. Many species live most of their lives as single cells, while others form colonies, long filaments, or highly differentiated macroscopic seaweeds. What's macroscopic mean? What's that? What's microscopic mean?
microscopic is
Small. So what's macroscopic mean?
very small.
Mhm.
Very small.
Big. You can see it with your eyes. Macroscopic. Some people use a macro lens on their phone. I have one like this. Here's one like this. That's a macro lens for my phone. It makes things really big. So macro means you can see it with your own naked eyes. It's so big. Macroscopic seaweeds like kelp, right? The land plants or embryophytes are thought to have emerged from the charophytes. Now you see this stuff here? So my grandparents had a pond in their yard. It was really cute. It was this perfectly round little, exactly what you'd envision when you envision like a perfect little pond. It's a perfect little round pond and their property line went right through the middle of it. They shared it with their neighbors on the other side. And it was brackish water, which means it has some salt in it, but it was really leaning towards fresh water. They lived 4 blocks off the ocean front. So their water came in from like the wetlands that were around that area. So anyway, and it got a lot of runoff. It was mostly runoff for this pond, but every year there was an algal bloom. And I'm talking, see how this stuff is? It would start to cover the pond. And my cousin and I would go out there with a stick and lift it. And it was like carpet. It was so thick. It was like this thick. It was crazy, huge. Yeah.
Have you ever been to Smith's Park? That little pond.
Oh, do they get it too?
So My friends, we scoop up green algae on a stick and then we chuck it at each other.
Oh, gross.
And then if it makes contact, you get a point.
Oh my
So when we start really talking about land plants that are absolutely plants, we move into bryophyta. Yeah.
I remember one story with algae when one time we were at the local Lake Lanier pond
Uh-huh.
and I went underwater and there was like algae.
Oh,
everywhere.
yeah.
I was like, "It's
Mhm.
not."
And it can get in fish tanks. And that's why people get those fish called plecostomus. They're those algae suckers. You ever see them? Kind of funny looking fish. They live on the side of the tank. They suck their little mouths on it. And then they suck all the algae off the tank. When I was in AP biology in high school, our teacher allowed us to get fish in a tank and we were all excited. And we named all the fish after scientists, which is what started my naming fish after scientists. Every fish I've ever had since then has been named after scientists. We had one fish in the tank that was not named after scientists, and it was the plecostomus, the algae sucker. And we called him Little Richard because our teacher's name was Richard Bauer. So it was kind of funny. So anyway, let's move on. Bryophyta. All right, so these are our first true seedless non-vascular plants. And bryophyta are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So in bryophytes, the gametophyte is the dominant recognizable stage of the life cycle and is the stage that carries out most of the plant's photosynthesis. So these plants have like a two-stage life cycle that they kind of float through, one and then the other, one and then the other. So this right here is actually a liverwort. This is what a liverwort looks like. So you might have seen it and not even realized what it was. If you were to go out in the woods back here behind my house, you probably could find some in the moist places, the cooler moist places. And wherever you're seeing moss, like there's moss in here, you can see the moss mixed in. And hornworts I don't see as much, but I do occasionally see a liverwort. Not too often. I see moss more often. So what are mosses? Okay, so mosses have flat green structures that resemble true leaves, and they absorb water and nutrients. Some mosses have small branches. Mosses have traits that are adaptations to dry land, such as stomata. Remember last week we looked at stomata. What are they? They're the little holes that are in the leaves. They have those little guard cells on both sides, remember?
Tiny little white pop.
Yeah, and they open and close for gas exchange, which is important. If you're doing photosynthesis, you got to have gas exchange. They also have stems in their sporophyte stage, which is their other life cycle part stage. So mosses are anchored to the substrate, which means the ground or the rock or whatever they're growing on, by rhizoids, which originate from the base of the gametophyte. Okay, so mosses don't really have roots. If you've ever pulled up a moss and looked at it, it has these hairy fibers that hang off the bottom, and those aren't really true roots. They're called rhizoids, and that's what helps moss, like you've probably seen it. It can grow up a wall, it can grow up a tree. That's what helps anchor it. Moss life cycle follows a pattern that we call alternation of generations. That's when it goes back and forth between two stages of the life cycle. So the gametophytes form male and female gametophores, which fertilize to form the sporophyte. And spores are released from the sporophyte to produce new gametophytes. So basically it goes from reproductive stage to new organism to reproductive to organism, which is kind of what all living things do, but these guys do it in a really obvious way. Like you can look at them and say, that one's in its reproductive form, that's in its mature form, and they just cycle. So the concentric tissue around the mouth of the capsule, and this is part of their reproductive stage. You ever seen the moss with they have these things that sit on them like this? It's like a filament, and then there's this little kind of brownish thing at the top. That's the capsule. And it's interesting because the tissues around them go in little concentric circles, and it's made of triangular close-fitting units that open and close to release the spores. So there's this thing called a peristome in there, and it increases the spread of the spores after the tip of the capsule falls off. They actually, there's some people who've gotten like macro photography, high def, and they go pop, and you can see them spit out their spores. It's really kind of cool. So liverworts and hornworts, these are a little different. These are a little leafier looking than moss, but they're not really leaves. So these leaf-like structures on liverworts are lobate. That means they have lobes, okay? Lobate and green structures similar to the lobes in a liver. So your liver has lobes, and that's why these are called liverworts, because of the shape. What kind of looks the same to whomever found them and decided that's what they should be called. And hornworts have these narrow pipe-like structures. So this here's a liverwort, and this here is a hornwort. You can see it has little horns, right? So the gametophyte stage is the dominant stage in both liverworts and hornworts. However, liverwort sporophytes do not contain stomata, while hornwort sporophytes do. The life cycle of liverworts and hornworts follows alternation generations again. Spores germinate into gametophytes, and the zygote develops into a sporophyte, releases spores, and they go again and again and again. Liverworts develop short, small sporophytes, whereas hornworts develop long, slender sporophytes. And I'm going to show you something interesting. So to aid in spore dispersal, liverworts utilize elaters, whereas hornworts utilize pseudoelaters. Here's what you need to know. Liverworts and hornworts can reproduce asexually if you break them apart, and then they can produce sexually through this alternation generations. Now, here's the thing I want you to see about liverworts. You see this little thing here? They have little cups that they grow on their leaves. Do you see a little cup? It's like a bowl, okay? And they call it gemme, is what it's called. So these little things in here, these are their spores. This is genius. So what they do is first they grow these structures that look like itty bitty palm trees. They have like a stem and then like a little umbrella top, okay? Like an umbrella or a palm tree, right? Okay. And the spores come out of there and they land in these little cups. Well, why do they land in these little cups? Okay, so these guys don't have a way to spread their spores. They're not tall enough for the wind to catch them. Animals don't eat them. So how do they spread their spores? They wait for the rain. When the rain comes, it hits these cups and it splashes. They're called splash cups. The raindrops splash and splash back out and spread their spores around, which is really kind of genius. Like that is really a neat adaptation. Whoop, didn't mean to do that.
In my Wings of Fire series, the author came up with, I think it was fire bomb cacti. It was
Oh, wow.
in the mountain. It grew in the mountains, and the mountain
Okay.
dragons all breathe fire. And so, if even like the slightest spark would touch this cacti, it would explode.
Oh, wow.
And it would spread its little spores
And make more cacti. Yep.
But they were also spiky, so it
Oh.
can stick to your skin.
That's no good. That's no good. So what's a bryophyte life cycle? So here's what we're talking about when we're talking about this sporophyte gametophyte life cycle. So you ever seen a moss looks like this? You ever seen these little guys on a moss? If you look really closely, you might see this. These are the capsules I was talking about. So bryophytes have life cycles that depend on water for reproduction. They lack vascular tissue, so they can only get water through osmosis. So those little thin leafy things that they have, they soak water in and out of their cells through them. That's the only way they can get water into their bodies because they don't have any roots for water. So this right here, I'm going to show you a guy who is super excited. Now I had these in your slideshow last week in case you wanted to go home and watch them, but remember, we didn't watch them in class. So this guy right here is a guy who is like obsessed with moss and obsessed with bryophytes. So this is called the sex lives of bryophytes, but it talks about how bryophytes reproduce. Make sure we have volume up. This guy is super excited.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the course. This is Matt from Infants of Plants, and today we're talking about the sex lives of bryophytes. Bryophytes being hornworts, liverworts, and mosses. It's a very wet day here in Central Illinois. It's the perfect time to be talking about this subject. So if you want to find out more, go ahead.
Yes.
So the form of reproduction that plants inherited from their algal ancestors is called alternation of generations, or metagenesis. And it involves a growth phase, which is asexual, which we're seeing here, called a gametophyte, and a sexual phase, called a sporophyte. Now, this alternation of generations occurs in all plants, but it is most obvious in the bryophytes, or at least easier to see in the bryophytes. So that's why we're going to focus on them today. It's very exciting and very interesting. And it's so
very exciting. He's so cute, this guy. Yeah.
So this is a little liverwort called Frulania. And like most bryophytes, it's small because it has to be. You see, bryophytes came onto the scene long before vascular tissue ever evolved, which means getting water to and from their cells is kind of difficult. They have to rely on osmosis to get water and diffusion to get the nutrients they need. That means if they get too big, they wouldn't be able to supply the rest of their body with these requirements. So the world of bryophytes happens on a miniature scale, and it's one that really is best appreciated with a hand or a microscope. So for today, we're going to just be enjoying them on trees and on the ground and on rocks. Bryophytes' ties to water goes even deeper. They simply can't sexually reproduce without it. You see, like us, their sperm or male gametes are flagellated. They need water to swim through. Now, at the tips of each one of these stems are housed the reproductive structures. If they're male, they're called antheridia. If they're female, they're called archegonia. And when it rains and water gets sloshed around, it inevitably picks up some of those sperm. And that continuous column of water allows the sperm to swim to where they find the female archegonia. And once they find those, they can fertilize them. And from that, you will see the sporophyte. So without water, there would be no sexual reproduction for the bryophytes. It's something that their algal ancestors had left them. It's a really cool and interesting process that requires a microscope to observe, but it's interesting to think that these plants have a little bit more in common with animals than we once thought. One of the most
Guys,
interesting
so
things
funny to
about
me.
mosses is that sporophyte and gametophyte generations are actually combined, although they are genetically distinct individuals. The green part of the moss tend to associate as a moss is actually the gametophyte phase. It is genetically haploid, meaning it only has one set of chromosomes, unlike us who have two, one from mom, one from dad. The sporophyte generation are these capsules coming off of these long hair-like structures at the top. And these are genetically diploid. They have two sets of chromosomes, and they are what produce the spores that will then be blown away out of these capsules into the breeze in hopes that they can find a new place to germinate and grow into a new gametophyte. Thus, the process repeats itself. It's this, again, alternation of these generations, but in the mosses, they're kind of connected. And even more bizarre is the fact that the sporophyte generation, for the most part, can't photosynthesize enough to support itself. Therefore, it is physically attached and takes water and nutrients from the gametophyte generation in order to produce the spores that it needs. I wouldn't really call this parasitism because at the end of the day, they're both benefiting through reproduction, but it's pretty cool to think that there are two genetically distinct organisms sitting here functioning as a single one.
Did you guys see it pop up in the background?
Yeah.
Yeah, he keeps doing that. This guy's a total trope.
Here it is. He should like shrink himself down and put him on the
Well, everyone, I hope this gives you a
Cracks
newfound
me up.
appreciation for the world of bryophytes. They're great plants to just take the time to get to
Yes,
know them.
dude. Yep.
If you're enjoying these videos, don't forget to hit subscribe and continue to follow us on all of our social media accounts. We are literally everywhere. So just Google In Defense of Plants.
Literally
We're also
everywhere,
on
In Defense of
Patreon,
Plants.
patreon.com.
This guy reminds me very much.
If you want to support these endeavors,
When I was in college, we were looking to hire a new professor for the biology department. We needed one more basically, and we needed someone with a botany focus because we had somebody with like an ecology focus, somebody with a micro focus, somebody that was more like neuro and anatomy. So we really needed somebody with a botany focus. And this guy came, this dude who had just finished his PhD, looking for a teaching job. And some of us got to be like hostess to him. So I was hostess to him for one day, and I walked him from the building where we had him staying, which was kind of near my house I was living in, over to the science building. And I made the mistake of asking him, so what was your thesis research on? Like, what was your PhD in? What were you really looking into? And he started talking with, this guy was so excited, right? This moss dude. This guy started talking about some extinct species of fern, some like Jurassic fern that he had done his entire research, like his whole life was about this Jurassic fern. And he just talked and talked, and he would not stop talking about the Jurassic
That
fern.
should be a movie.
It was
The
funny.
Jurassic Park.
Oh, he was telling me all about it. I mean, he could
Jurassic
tell me
World.
everything about this fern because he'd spent years on it. So is the following sentence true or false? Non-vascular plants can absorb water and nutrients directly into their cells. Is that true or false? That's true. That's right. All right. And so this was also part of your homework. So your non-vascular plants are mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. So your mosses, we talked about, your hornworts, and your liverworts. Okay. And then our two characteristics of non-vascular plants that you could list is that they're low growing. Why are they low growing? Why aren't they tall?
Because they don't have a lot of water.
They don't have a vascular system. They can't move the water around. They can't grow taller. And what else? We also say that they live in moist areas for the same reason, right? They don't have roots to suck up water. They have to get it through the environment. So how about non-vascular plants? Can they be very large? No, not very large. So then the next thing we move on to now are our seedless vascular. So we had seedless non-vascular, now we have seedless vascular. So your best example of this is going to be ferns. If you've ever seen ferns, this is what we're talking about. So both forms of vascular tissue, which is xylem and phloem, can move fluids throughout the plant body, even against the force of gravity. So here are two types of vascular tissues in plants. We have our xylem, and it's primarily involved in transporting water and minerals from the roots to the shoots and providing structural support. Xylem vessels are tough and strong, and those vascular bundles are found in the center of the root to resist forces that could pull the plant out of the ground, and they're arranged near the edge of the stem, with the phloem on the outside and the xylem on the inside to help the system resist compression and bending forces by the plant's weight and by wind. So it's sort of almost like arteries and veins, but not really. And then your phloem, these are beautifully stained pictures. This is a xylem right here. And then this is phloem. This is the structure of it. If you stained it with whatever, I'm not sure what stain they use here. So your phloem is a vascular tissue that functions primarily by transporting organic materials like sucrose that you make during photosynthesis from your leaf to all the parts of the plant. So that we call that translocation. If you make sucrose in a leaf and you transport it to a root, we call that translocation. And in woody plants like trees, the phloem is the innermost layer of the bark next to the wood. So they make a new phloem every year, which is why when you look at trees, you can see rings. That's what that is. And that's why sometimes the width of that ring, of a tree ring, scientists can tell if it was a wet year, a dry year, a good year for nutrients, a bad year for nutrients, just by looking at how much phloem they grew that year. And it's really kind of interesting. You can tell a lot about the history of an area by its tree rings. Now, one way to remember these is your xylem is the one that's doing really, really active stuff, right? Like it's pulling water up to the top of the tree. But your phloem is letting the stuff the tree makes flow around. So if you remember that your phloem helps stuff flow from the leaves down or everywhere else, then you can tell which one is which. That helps you remember. So we have a couple types, three main types of our seedless vascular plants. We have club mosses, horsetails, and ferns. This is a club moss. Some people call it reindeer moss. You may have seen it. Not really a moss because it's vascular. It actually has vascular tissues. So club mosses have a very similar life cycle to our bryophytes. So do our horsetails and our ferns. So you start with this little guy on the ground here, and then he makes he has the spores come down and it grows like this, and then it gets big and produces spores and it cycles round and round, right? Same thing with the horsetail, same thing with the ferns. So these guys have no seeds, they have spores. If you've ever taken a fern leaf and turned it over and seen all these little brown dots, have you ever seen little brown dots on the back of a fern leaf? Yeah, those are the spores. That's what that is. So if you ever see that, that's what you're looking at. Do you know what this is called when you see this is a fern that's curled all up? Do you know what they call them when they're curled up like that? They call it a fiddlehead. Think about what a violin looks like, the end of a violin. Yeah. Okay, so they call them a fiddlehead. And this is how they start out, actually. If you walk out in the woods right now, you can probably find some. They unravel like those party blowers that blow and they unravel and come back. That's exactly how a fern grows. It curls itself out, which is really cool. So ferns and other vascular plants have a life cycle in which the diploid sporophyte is the dominant stage. Now, remember, they talked about moss. When you see the green leafy stuff, that's haploid. It only has half the chromosomes, right? But the diploid stage needs it to live. Whereas in this case, most of the time when you see a fern, you're seeing, a mature fern, and it's actually its sporophyte stage. So it has both sets of chromosomes. It's like fully formed individual. Okay, this is bizarre, but you got to watch. Did you see it? All right. So you got to watch to understand what's going on, because there's not narration, but it's kind of funny, but it's a life cycle of a fern. And I love the way it's done. I had to do it because it's just weird. All right. So you got to watch to know what's going on though. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah. So we got a fern leaf, right? They're the spores that are on the back of the leaves. Spore dispersal squad. Love it.
Get belly.
Bizarre, right? Lily's looking at me like, did we actually watch that?
How did it grow so quick?
I don't know, man. That took some time. Whoever did that spent some time on that, but it's great. It shows exactly how it works. So seedless vascular plants have a system of what? What do we call it? That move food and water through the plant. We call it, it could be tubes or vascular tissues or whatever you want to call them, right? Okay. So then our next thing evolutionarily here are seeded vascular plants. So we've gone from having no seeds and no vascular tissue to having no seeds and vascular tissue. Now I've got vascular tissue and seeds. So we're getting more and more advanced. So what adaptations do seeded vascular plants need to move to drier land? Adaptations that allow seed plants to reproduce in areas without water include flowers or cones that the transfer of sperm by pollination and protection of embryos and seeds. So this is what's left when the petals of a flower fall off. This is actually the fruit of a particular plant. That's my neighbor's having his backyard like remodeled. So they're dropping rocks and it's been loud. And he's totally jacked up the grass and he's like, oh, replace your grass. So they're using our driveway because it's just easier for them, which is fine. So anyway, does anybody know what kind of flower this was? Do you recognize it? This is what's left when a poppy. Yeah, this is the little fruit that a poppy produces. So there's poppy seeds in here. Do you know what poppies are used for besides poppy seed muffins and stuff like that? So poppy seeds is a source of opium, right? So opium, while it can be an illicit drug and in the past has been used like almost as a tool to kind of control certain communities, there's a whole history of opium use, like being forced onto certain people so that they can be used for certain things. But also it's used for pain medications like morphine, oxycodone, those kinds of things. So this is really important, poppy seeds. So gymnosperms are going to be our first kind of plant that we're going to talk about here that is seeded, vascular.
Jim likes ice cream cones.
Yep, but they don't flower. So our gymnosperms, you're going to recognize probably as things like conifers and pine trees, but there's no flowers, seeds, but no flowers. So the first type that we talk about are called neophytes. And these you may not see very often or you may not recognize. So neophytes consist of 3 genera, which means 3 different genus, right, of woody plants grouped in the gymnosperms. The living neophyte comprise some 70 species. So not a whole ton, right, across 3 genera, which are Needham, Welwitschia, I think, and Ephedra. Neophytes differ from other gymnosperms in having vessel elements found in flowering plants. So they're kind of similar. Their vessels are kind of similar to flowering plants, but they're these low, kind of brushy growing things. They're a type of neophyte, type of gymnosperm, and you probably won't deal with them much in your life, like day to day. Cycads are really cool. They look like a pineapple. It's not a pineapple. So cycads, pineapples are not cycads. Cycads are, yeah, it does. Well, they're very similar. So cycads are woody, seed-producing plants with no flowers or fruit. They look similar to palm trees with branchless stems and a crown of leaf at the top of the tree, but they're not related to palm trees. They have branched fallen leaves that leave scars, like a palm tree has scars on its side where the leaves have fallen off. They have that, but they're not related to palm trees. And then internally, the stems are mostly made of soft storage tissue rather than wood. And the roots, this is interesting. The roots, they call them coralloid roots because they look like coral. You ever seen ocean coral, the shape of it? That's what these roots look like, which is really interesting. That's not really what you're used to seeing as roots, right? Their roots look like that. So these guys don't get super tall. They maybe, some of them get maybe this big, and then they do grow these big cones in the middle that look almost like pineapples. Now this guy is interesting, a ginkgo. You ever heard of people taking ginkgo? People take ginkgo supplements. They take ginkgo biloba. They take like herbal supplements made with ginkgo. The cool thing about ginkgo is it's a gymnosperm, but it has leaves like that. See the leaves? They look like regular leaves.
They look like tree.
Yeah, they're really an interesting shape, and people like them so much that, like, if you go into Hobby Lobby or something over to the decor section, you're going to find ginkgo leaves in certain types of decor because it's just interesting looking. But ginkgo is the only species, ginkgo biloba is the only species of ginkgo. It's the only gymnosperm of its type. But they don't make fruit and they don't make flowers. They are also deciduous, which is different. Do you know what deciduous means? It means they drop their leaves in the fall. So this tree acts almost like an angiosperm tree, which is a flowering tree, which we're going to get to in a minute, because it drops its leaves. And if you look at it and you just see it, you would think it's a flowering plant, a regular everyday tree, but it's not. It's a gymnosperm. Also in the fall, ginkgo biloba will turn the brightest yellow you can imagine. There's one on Sterling, which is the back route into the neighborhood. If you come through the back route, not through the front gate, and it is screaming yellow. I mean, beautiful yellow in the fall. The last group, the main group, the group that you're most familiar with are conifers. Okay, so conifers are, it's Pinophyta, right? That's the group that they're in, like pine trees. And there's fossil gymnosperms in here, and then there's our evergreens that we see every day. So if you look outside now and you see something with needles on it, conifers, pine trees, spruce, any kind of fir tree, your Christmas tree. These are all gymnosperms, and they produce seeds in cones. And gymnosperm actually means naked seed because their seeds are not within a fruit. They're just naked and they're inside the pine cone. And those green pine cones that you see on the tree, that's where the seeds are inside. And when the pine cone dries and opens up, you'll see the little pine seeds come out, and they look almost like the maple tree helicopters, but they're not quite the same shape. And squirrels love them. I've seen squirrels try and eat them. Now, conifers have male and female cones. The big cones, the kind that you step on and go, ah, those are the female cones. The male cones are the little ones. They look almost like little caterpillars. They get all over the trees. Yeah. So what are gymnosperm plants? Let's watch this quick. I'm watching our time.
Do you want to know what gymnosperm plants are? In
I'm gonna
this
watch the
daily
video.
video, we're going to give you its definition, explain its characteristics, and its reproduction. We'll also give you some examples and detail what differentiates them from angiosperm plants. Let's get started. What are gymnosperm plants? Gymnosperm plants are vascular plants and spermatophytes. But what does this mean? Well, they are produced from a seed and they also generate seeds. The Greek word gymno means naked, while sperma means seed. Therefore, its name indicates that its seeds are naked and do not develop in a closed ovary as fruit would. These plants tend to develop in all areas of the world. But with that being said, they are mostly common in cold and Arctic climates. Characteristics of gymnosperm plants. They are really old since they date back to the end of the Carboniferous period. They have vascular tissues that allow them to distribute water and other resources from their roots to their leaves. They produce a seed that does not develop in an ovary. They are woody plants with an arboreal appearance, and they have stems, leaves, roots, and seeds. They are generally plants without flowers or fruits, and they can form cones that generate fertile leaves. Examples of gymnosperm plants. There are 88 genera of gymnosperm plants, among which there are more than 1,000 different species. Some examples are the following. Pinophytas, also known as conifers, are the most important group of gymnosperms that includes around 600 species of woody plants. They are evergreen and have deciduous leaves, generally needle-shaped such as pines. Psychedophytas, also known as cycads. These are plants similar to palm trees that grow in regions with tropical and subtropical climate. Ginkgophytas, which includes several extinct species and one that is still living. That's the ginkgo biloba, a deciduous tree that is characterized by its fan-shaped leaves. And netophytes. These plants have short stems and long scaly leaves from vines or small shrubs. Also, did you know that the largest tree in the world is a redwood, which belongs to the group of gymnosperms? Before we continue, let's put you to the test. How tall do you think this tree is? 95 meters tall, 105 meters tall, or 115 meters tall?
105.
That was the last
344.
The correct answer is C. The tallest tree in the world, called Hyperion, is exactly 115.55
Hyperion, if you want to
meters
know,
tall,
is the
which
tallest
is
tree in the world. It has a name.
179.1 feet tall. Isn't that incredible?
It's called
How do
Hyperion.
they reproduce?
There's
The
no
female cones contain a scale with 2 ovules, while the smaller male cones are formed by 1 scale and 2 pollen cells that form pollen grains.
Maybe the tallest in Georgia.
Both the pollen grains
It's
and
like
the
a second
ovules
cell.
are called
Okay.
gametes because they're the reproductive cells. Reproduction begins when the wind carries the pollen grain to the female flowers, and the pollen tube penetrates to the ovule so that the gametes fuse together and give rise to the zygotes. After fertilization, the seed is formed and the female inflorescence transforms into a cone. After a while, this cone opens and releases the seeds that will form new plants when they fall on the ground. Together, both the pollination and the fertilization are a slow progress that can take even more than a year. In addition, the maturation of the seeds can take up to 3
See those little things? Those little things, those are those male cones.
differences between gymnosperms and angiosperms. As mentioned before, gymnosperms bear seeds, while the seeds of angiosperms are covered by fruit. Gymnosperms are usually perennial plants, while angiosperms are usually seasonal. While gymnosperms have cones, angiosperms typically have flowers. Unlike gymnosperm leaves, which are usually pointy and needle-shaped, angiosperms leaves are usually flat. In addition, gymnosperm plants are usually woody, while angiosperms are usually herbaceous. Some examples of angiosperm plants are orange trees, sunflowers, lilies, and birch trees. Let us know in the comments below if you would like.
Okay, so we're gonna whip through this next part because we're watching the time. We're probably gonna run into lab just a little bit. So true or false, in seed plants, the plant that you see is the gametophyte stage.
True.
False, this is sporophyte. Okay, so I'll just show you those. So your naked fruit, obviously, gymnosperms do have vascular tissue. Most common group are your conifers, and your seed dispersal are wind, water, animals, and things like gravity, explosion, fire. Those can all spread it. All right, so we're gonna do angiosperms real quickly. All right, angiosperms are seeded flowering plants. This is where we get pretty much everything we eat that is plant-like. We don't typically, well, you can eat algae. They put algae and stuff all the time. Like, no, they do. They put it in supplements. They put it in smoothies. They put it in drinks. Yeah. So how do angiosperms reproduce? Well, angiosperms have unique reproductive organs known as flowers. There's your reproductive organ. Flowers contain ovaries, which surround and protect seeds. So this is the basic anatomy of a flower. Next week, we're going to be dissecting a flower. So we're going to really get into it. But basically what you need to know is this is where your fertilization takes place. You've got your, these right here are your male parts. These are the stamen. This whole structure here is called a pistil. And at the top of the pistil is the stigma, which has like a little hole and it's sticky. Now, a flower can self-pollinate where this pollen from these male organs touches the female organ and it's self-pollinated. In that case, it's still sexual reproduction because you had a male gamete and a female gamete come together and make a new zygote, a new organism. But it's going to be genetically the same as the parent because the male and the female gamete came from the same flower. But if you have another flower's pollen touch this female part, then you get a sexual reproduction situation. And that happens either with wind or usually insects, right? Or birds that pollinate. But anyway, that bit of male DNA is going to get down here in here where the ovary is. And that's where they have these things called ovules. And those get fertilized. And those become the seeds in a fruit. And this whole piece will grow into the fruit. See right here? This is the ovary. And it becomes the apple. If you look at an apple, not the stem end, but the other end, there's usually like this little leafy looking thing. That's where the flower was. That's where it fell off. So we have different kinds of fruit. We have these drier ones that need to pop open for their seeds to be dispersed. We have these guys here that fall or float, and they're usually very dry. And then we have these fleshy ones here that these are the kind we eat a lot, right? So what about seeds? We have two different types of seeds, monocots and dicots. So monocotyledon and dicotyledon. So if you think about a lima bean, everybody's eaten a lima bean before, right? Everybody knows what a lima bean looks like, but you know what they look like, right? If you take a lima bean and you gently rub it between your fingers, you can split it into two parts, right? Everybody ever done that, seen it? Okay, that is a dicot, the dicotyledon. Each of those is a cotyledon, right? And they are what's necessary to nourish the plant as it grows from a seed into a new seedling. Now, if you think about corn, you can't do that with corn. Corn doesn't split into two. It's got one seed, one part of a seed. That's a monocotyledon. You can push out that little white thing, but that's not a cotyledon. It's just kind of one of these structures. Yeah, so monocots, all right, corn is your example, and here is a bean. I don't know if it's a kidney bean or what. But if you look at a plant and its leaf looks like this, and it's got parallel veins, it's a monocot. You count the flower parts, and you find that they are in multiples of 3. You can divide it by 3. It's a monocot. And if you were to do a cross section and look at it under a microscope, and it was all spread out with their vascular tissue, it's a monocot. And then their roots are spread like this. So, and here's a dicot. You got 2 parts to the seed, branched veins, multiple parts, often in multiples of 4 or 5. So if you count the petals on the flower and you find that they're in 4 or 5, you have a dicot. You can also check the stems the same way and the roots. So even if you don't have a seed from a plant, you can typically tell if it's a monocot or a dicot with one of these other clues, okay? This is definitely something to kind of study a bit. Okay, yeah.
Onions are monocots.
Onions, yeah, and you eat the root of the onion.
Yeah, you can also eat the onion.
Yep. So there are 3 categories of plant lifespans. We have annuals, biennials, and perennials. So you've probably seen this if you go to Home Depot, right? Your annuals, basically they grow and they die in 1 year. Your biennials take 2 years, and your perennials come back every year. So if you want to plant something in your yard just for a season, you know how you plant sometimes things for a season, like a pansy maybe or whatever, you put it in and then next spring you have to put in new flowers. Those are annuals. But your flowers that come back every year are your perennials. So woody and herbaceous, when we compare these two, woody plants, this is kind of obvious, have stems that live for several years, adding new growth like height and width each year. And herbaceous plants tend to have stems that die back. So herbaceous plants are the softer of the ones, right? Woody is woody. So I think this is our last little video. We're going to watch this real quick, and then we'll start their class in just a minute.
Sexual reproduction in plants. In
Lovely
this
accent.
module, you will learn how sexual reproduction takes place in flowering plants. It is spring season. Flowers are blooming on the trees. It is indeed a beautiful sight. Flowers attract all of us. They are the most beautiful part of the plant, isn't it? You already know that flowers are not present only to add beauty to the plant. They are in fact the reproductive part of the plant. In the flower, stamen is the male reproductive part, while carpel is the female reproductive part. Some flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called bisexual flowers.
Most of them are like
For
that.
example, pea, China rose, etc. On the other hand, some flowers possess either the male or the female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called unisexual flowers. For example, corn, cucumber, etc. Now let us know about the different parts that make up a stamen and a carpel. A stamen is made of 2 main parts, anther and filament. The anther produces pollen grains. It is the pollen grain that contains the male gametes. A carpel, on the other hand, is made up of 3 parts. The terminal part is called the stigma. The middle elongated part is the style, and the swollen bottom part is the ovary. Inside the ovary, ovules are present. It is the ovule that has the female gamete called the egg cell. For sexual reproduction to take place, a male gamete is to be fused with the female gamete, thereby forming a zygote. Now for that, the male gametes have to reach the female gametes. For this, first a pollen grain carrying the male gametes is transferred from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same or the other flower. Such transfer of pollen grains is known as pollination. If the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of the same flower, it is called self-pollination. But if the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of another flower of the same or another plant of the same type, it is called cross-pollination. Pollination occurs with the help of different agents like wind, water, or animals. Once a pollen grain reaches the stigma of a suitable flower, a tube grows from the pollen grain. This tube travels through the style and reaches the ovary. The male gamete from the pollen travels in this tube and reaches to the female gamete present in the ovule of the ovary. After that, the male and the female gamete fuse together to form the zygote. This process of fusion of male and female gametes is called fertilization. The zygote formed after the fertilization then divides several times to form an embryo inside the ovule. The ovule develops a tough coat and changes to a seed. The ovary, on the other hand, ripens and forms a fruit around the seed. At this time, the other parts of the flower, like the sepals and petals, fall off. So, a seed present inside a fruit contains an embryo, which is actually a baby plant. Each time a seed is planted in soil and provided appropriate conditions, it grows into a seedling, which then...
Oh yeah, we get it. We know what happens then. So yes, when you're eating a fruit, you're eating the ovule, right? So there's a last bit here, your angiosperms, let's say, don't produce naked seeds. They do have flowers and they grow everywhere. So pine trees have cones, and after fertilization, fertilized egg develops into the embryo. When seeds are mature, scales open, wind carries the seeds away, and the seeds that land in suited place grow into new plants. Monocots have long, narrow, and straight leaves, and dicots have vascular tissue bundled up in their stems, and flower parts in multiples of 3. That's basically that part. And here's your flower. You're going to be doing that more and more of that. Real quick, there's a picture. Here's your plant kingdom divided. Non-vascular, which is divided into these guys here, right? These are non-vascular. Here we got vascular over here, spore producing and seed producing, and then these get broken down into flowering and non-flowering. So that's that. Now, I'm gonna try something and see if it works. Drew, you want me to try? Alexa, play Reveille on Pub Echo.
Reveille by various artists playing on Pub Echo on Amazon Music.
Jason hooked it up to the big horn. All right, bye, Scott. We'll see you later.